Hello all! We have finally reached the month of February and it is day 25 of session. It's almost halftime! If it was the Super Bowl and my bill was marching down the field hoping to score to stay alive in this legislative session, my bill would have to be at least maybe on the 40-yard line. In this perhaps slightly flawed analogy, that means it must have passed out of the Policy Committee in the House of Origin on January 31st. If any bill did not get a public hearing in the Policy Committee in the House of Origin, it died. Game over. If any bill did not get an executive session in the Policy Committee in the House of Origin, it died. Game over. However, the game is still continuing for us. Our three bills all made it past their first cutoff, and they're all making their way through the lawmaking process. To continue my football analogy, they are all receiving passes and making plays on their way toward the end zone. Since last week, a couple of things have happened with our legislation, and most of these things involve amendments. Now, it's important to remember that Olympia during the legislative session is a fast-moving place, and legislators and stakeholders are talking all the time, in the halls, outside the buildings, in their offices, and in their party caucuses. Everywhere. At this point, you might be asking, what is a party caucus? Well, both the Democrats and the Republicans have a caucus room off the floor, and basically it's a fancy word for a meeting room. So Democrats meet with other Democrats to strategize and talk about priorities, and Republicans meet with Republicans to strategize and talk about priorities. It's kind of like what's happening during halftime at the Super Bowl. They have caucus staffers who are legislative aides who are partisan, so they give advice to the legislators on bills. So many of these amendments come out of these meetings, whether these are formal meetings in caucus rooms or informal meetings in the hallways. So 5884, our environmental crimes bill, it is the furthest one down the football field. It is now on step 6. It has made it out of its House of Origin. It was voted off of the floor of the Senate today, and now it's on its way to the House. It'll probably be a little while before we see it take some action on the House, but that is where it's going. On the floor for 5884, Senator McEwen, a Republican, raised an amendment to this bill that clarifies when the courts can order this restitution, the financial payout, to those who have been convicted of an environmental crime. Ultimately, it did not pass and it did not become part of the bill. However, to continue talking a little bit more about football, it does operate kind of as a timeout on the floor, as it will take time to debate, possibly taking time away from other pieces of legislation. Marissa will talk more about the politics behind the amendment strategies in her video. And now, 5846, the Beaver Bill. I hope that everyone enjoyed watching the interview with the representative from the Department of Fish and Wildlife last week. I know that I found it illuminating. And I've decided that in the ecological world, the plural of beaver is beaver, just like moose. But in every other world, they are beavers. Just a slight grammatical note for you. Now, as I noted last week, last Thursday the 25th, the Beaver Bill had an executive session. There were 5 amendments raised to this bill. And here's where my football analogy breaks down. Senator Solomon, a Democrat and the prime sponsor, raised amendments, and 3 Republicans also raised amendments. Senator Solomon really recommended that 2 of these Republican amendments be adopted, which showed a lot of bipartisanship, which does not happen on the football field. You can watch the executive session in the feed. Senate Bill 5846 has been referred to Ways and Means. That's step 3 of the process, and it's awaiting a public hearing. Marissa will talk about in her video whether she thinks it's actually going to get that public hearing or not. And now for HB 2049, the REWRAP Act. There is some serious momentum surrounding this bill. It is currently on step 3 in the House Fiscal Committee, called Appropriations, but unlike the Beaver Bill, it has had both a public hearing and it is scheduled already for an executive session. Clearly, the Democratic majority, remember that the chair has the power to schedule these hearings, would like to score and get this bill passed out of the Fiscal Committee. The public hearing was this morning at 10:30 a.m. and I had the chance to be there live. The room was full of people passionate about this piece of legislation and other pieces of legislation as well. Since this was a fiscal committee, most of the testimony surrounded the cost of the legislation and the cost of the products if the legislation passes. You can see excerpts from the committee hearing in the feed below. The executive session is scheduled for Friday, February 3rd at 9 a.m., and we'll report on that next week. If any bill, including this one, does not make it past the fiscal committees by Monday, February 5th, they are dead and they have now lost the game. As for all the football analogies this week, as you can tell, I'm excited for the Super Bowl, and football isn't even my favorite sport. Just wait until baseball season. See you next week.